Montana of 300's legal case just took a turn after he was found guilty in a domestic violence case that could put him behind bars for a very long time. And for a rapper who built everything on his own, this could bring his entire career to a brutal end. Here's what happened. The news broke fast. A jury in Illinois found Montana of 300 guilty, and the number attached to his name overnight was 12. A 37-year-old Chicago rapper was found guilty and facing up to 12 years in prison for a domestic violence incident with his former girlfriend. That's the headline that started spreading across hip-hop pages, fan accounts, and news aggregators within hours of the verdict landing. For a guy who spent over a decade selling the idea that he answers to nobody, that headline hit different. Montana of 300, real name Walter Anthony Bradford, has always framed himself as an independent artist, someone who built an empire without a major label holding his hand. Now that empire is sitting on a courtroom bench, waiting to hear how many years a judge is going to hand him. The case traces back to Peoria, Illinois, the city where Bradford grew up before Chicago became the home most people associate with him. Walter Anthony Tony Bradford, born March 3, 1989, better known by his stage name Montana of 300, is an American rapper, singer, and songwriter from Peoria, Illinois. That's where this entire chapter started, and it's where it's now reaching its conclusion in a courtroom. The arrest that led to all of this happened in early 2025. The rapper was arrested on February 11, 2025, on multiple charges, including criminal trespassing, domestic battery, resisting arrest, and theft. That combination of charges is what eventually funneled into the trial that just wrapped. And it's the domestic battery charge tied to the incident with his former girlfriend that carried the weight in front of the jury. Body cam footage from that night surfaced months later and gave the public its first real look at what happened. The footage provided by police shows officers arriving where Montana of 300 is involved in a heated argument with the child's mother. And as the argument heated up, police tried to hold on to the rapper, resulting in officers using a taser against him. That footage became one of the most circulated pieces of evidence in the entire case, replayed on hip-hop blogs and reaction channels long before a jury ever saw it in a courtroom. Following the incident, police took Bradford into custody on charges including criminal trespass, domestic battery, resisting arrest, and theft. He was granted bail after being taken into custody, which meant he spent the better part of a year and a half walking around as a free man while this case built toward trial. That stretch of time let him keep working, keep posting, keep showing up to interviews, all while this charge sat over his head like a countdown clock nobody could see. Now that clock has a number on it, 12 years. That's the ceiling prosecutors can push for once sentencing rolls around. And it's the number that's turned casual fans into courtroom watchers overnight. What makes this verdict land so hard isn't just a potential time, it's who it's happening to. Montana of 300 isn't some background name in Chicago rap. He built himself into one of the most recognizable independent success stories to come out of the city's drill and lyricism scene combined. A guy who proved you didn't need a machine behind you to chart nationally. That's the story people are used to hearing about him. The guilty verdict flips the script entirely, and it's forcing fans to sit with a version of Montana of 300 story that has nothing to do with bars or album sales. The reaction online has been split right down the middle, the same way it split back when the arrest first made headlines. As news of the legal trouble spread, people were split. Some fans were disappointed, hoping he'd shed the excess of his legal troubles and just release music, while others stood firm, praising his tenacity and calling for his immediate release. That divide hasn't gone anywhere. If anything, the guilty verdict has hardened both sides. The fans who think he's being made an example of, and the fans who think this has been building for years and finally caught up with him. What nobody's arguing about is the stakes. 12 years isn't a slap on the wrist. It's the kind of number that ends careers, ends momentum, and puts a hard stop on whatever plans an artist had for the next chapter of their life. For a man who built his whole brand on outworking everybody else, a sentence anywhere near that ceiling would be the loudest silence his fan base has ever heard. And that's exactly the tension hanging over what comes next. Before the sentencing hearing, before the number gets finalized, there's a full story here. The night in Peoria that started it, a history of legal trouble that stretches back further than most fans realize, and a career that's been climbing since before most drill rappers even had a deal. All of that context matters now more than ever, because it's what a judge is going to weigh when deciding just how close to that 12-year mark this actually goes. To understand how Montana of 300 ended up in front of a jury, you have to go back to the night that started it all. The arrest that made headlines across hip-hop media in early 2025. The charges themselves tell part of the story on their own. The rapper, whose real name is Walter Anthony Bradford, was arrested on multiple charges, including criminal trespassing, domestic battery, resisting arrest, and theft. 4 separate charges, all stemming from one incident, all filed the same night. That's not a minor scuffle. That's a full arrest report with multiple counts attached, the kind that immediately signals a serious situation to anyone reading it. The body cam footage that came out later filled in what those charges looked like in real time. Police arrived to find Bradford in the middle of an argument with the mother of one of his children. The footage shows police officers arriving where Montana of 300, aka Walter Anthony Bradford, is involved in a heated argument with the child's mother. This wasn't a stranger, wasn't a random dispute. It was a domestic situation involving someone he shares a child with, which is exactly why the domestic battery charge carried the weight it did once things reached trial. What happened next escalated fast. As the argument heated up, the clip shows police trying to hold onto the rapper, resulting in police using the taser against him. Getting tased isn't something that happens over a calm conversation. It happens when officers feel like a situation is spiraling past the point where words are working. That's the moment that turned an argument into an arrest. And it's the moment that shows up again and again in the footage clips that have circulated since. The footage wasn't perfect evidence either. Even though the recording is clear, some details, such as police dialogue and the order of events, weren't provided, leaving room for speculation and conflicting opinions. That gap is exactly why this case needed a full trial, instead of settling early. There was enough footage to prove something happened, but not enough clarity on exactly how it unfolded to make either side comfortable walking away without a jury weighing in. Once the dust settled that night, Bradford was in custody facing the 4 charges that would define the next year and a half of his life. Following the incident, police took Bradford into custody for multiple charges, including criminal trespass, domestic battery, resisting arrest, and theft, and he was granted bail after being taken into custody. That bail release is important context, because it's the reason Montana of 300 didn't disappear from public life the moment those charges were filed. He kept his presence up, kept engaging with fans, kept operating like someone confident the case would break in his favor. That confidence is part of what makes the guilty verdict such a gut punch for people who'd been following the case loosely. Plenty of fans assumed this would fizzle out the way some of his past legal issues did. It didn't fizzle out, it went to trial, and a jury heard the domestic battery charge in the context of everything else attached to that night. The trespassing, the resisting arrest, the theft charge sitting alongside it. Prosecutors had a full narrative to present. A man who didn't just have a disagreement, but who allegedly trespassed onto a property, got physical enough that officers had to physically restrain him, resisted that restraint hard enough to warrant a taser, and left with a theft charge attached on top of everything else. That combination is what likely pushed the sentencing exposure as high as it went. A single misdemeanor domestic dispute doesn't usually carry a 12-year ceiling. It's the stacking of charges, trespass, battery, resisting, theft, that builds toward a number that large, especially once prior history gets factored into how a judge and jury view the pattern of behavior. And that's where this story gets even more complicated, because this wasn't the first time Montana of 300 found himself on the wrong side of a domestic case. There's a history here that stretches back years before the Peoria incident ever happened, and it's a history that almost certainly shaped how seriously this most recent case was treated from the moment it hit the docket. If this were the first time Montana of 300 had been connected to a domestic case, the guilty verdict might read differently to a jury. It's not the first time. There's a paper trail here that goes back years, and it's the kind of pattern that makes a 12-year ceiling make a lot more sense. Back when he was still building his name outside of Chicago's biggest stages, Bradford already had a domestic case attached to his record. A Nebraska newspaper report from years earlier put it plainly. Walter A. Bradford, 31, aka Montana of 300, was set to serve 2 years probation for a beating incident. That case predates the Peoria arrest by roughly half a decade, and it's the kind of detail that rarely makes it into the highlight reel of an artist's biography. But it's exactly the kind of thing a prosecutor brings up when arguing for a stiffer sentence the second time around. That earlier probation sentence means this wasn't Bradford's first brush with the legal system over a domestic incident. Probation is typically the outcome a first-time offender gets when a judge believes there's a real chance to correct behavior without locking someone up. It's a second chance. What happened in Peoria years later suggests at least in the eyes of the jury that just convicted him, that the second chance didn't stick the way it was supposed to. It's not just domestic cases either. Bradford's relationship with the legal system has had other chapters that fans have been aware of for years, mostly through his own words. In an interview years before any of this, he opened up about being connected to serious allegations tied to violence in his community, discussing being blamed for murders, and facing years in prison over accusations that stretched far beyond anything related to music. That interview painted a picture of an artist who'd spent a good chunk of his adult life navigating serious legal exposure completely separate from his career, long before the Peoria case ever entered the picture. That history matters here because it changes the entire framing of what a guilty verdict means for someone like Montana of 300. This isn't a first offender getting an unusually harsh outcome. This is a man with a documented history of legal trouble tied to violence and domestic conflict, now facing his most serious exposure yet, right at the moment when the rest of his life, his catalog, his brand, his family, was supposed to be settling into a more stable chapter. There's also the timing to consider. The Peoria arrest happened right as Bradford was already dealing with the idea that his most recent solo album might be behind him. He had previously said 2022's Rap God would be his last solo project. That means the guilty verdict is landing at a moment when there wasn't already a wall of new music scheduled to distract from it. No upcoming rollout to compete with the headlines. The timing couldn't have lined up worse. An artist who'd already stepped back from new solo releases, now facing the most serious legal outcome of his career, with nothing in the pipeline to soften the blow. Fans who followed Bradford's story for years have seen this tension before. The gap between the guy who raps about turning his life around and the guy who keeps ending up back in a courtroom. It's a story as old as the time when personal demons were part of an artist's mythology. That line has been used to describe plenty of rappers before him. But it hits differently when the number attached to the latest chapter is 12 years instead of a headline that fades in a week. What's clear is that the jury wasn't looking at an isolated incident. They were looking at a man whose file included a prior domestic case that ended in probation, a documented history of serious legal exposure tied to violence, and now a fresh conviction stacked with 4 separate charges from one night in Peoria. That's the kind of record that makes prosecutors comfortable asking for the higher end of a sentencing range. And it's the kind of record that makes a defense's job at sentencing exponentially harder. None of that erases what Montana of 300 built with his music, though. And that's exactly why this outcome stings the way it does for the people who followed his career since the beginning. To understand the full weight of what's potentially being lost here, you have to look at just how far this Peoria kid actually climbed before any of this became the headline. Before any of this, before the arrest, before the trial, before the guilty verdict. Montana of 300 was one of the clearest examples in modern hip-hop of what independence actually looks like when it works. He didn't come up through a label system. He built his own lane from the ground floor. He started the rap collective 300 in 2008 alongside Montel Tally, named after the 300 movie's warrior ethos. That collective became the foundation for everything that followed. A crew mentality built around the idea of standing your ground against bigger odds. A theme that would end up defining Bradford's entire public persona for the next decade and a half. The name was based on the movie of the same name, in which a group of 300 Spartans overcome more than 300,000 Persian soldiers to hold their territory. And Montana was particularly inspired by the line about no surrender, no retreat, only the hard, only the strong against all odds. That's not just branding. That's the entire mythology Bradford built his career on. The underdog who refuses to fold. The guy who takes on impossible numbers and comes out standing. It's almost impossible to hear that origin story now without thinking about the 12-year number hanging over him. The breakthrough moment came a few years after the group formed. He gained traction in 2014 with Cursed with a Blessing, a mixtape that solidified his reputation as a lyrical force to be reckoned with. That project put him on the radar in a way street buzz alone hadn't managed to do, and it set up what came next, the moment that turned him from a respected name in Chicago's underground into someone with actual national chart numbers behind him. His 2016 independent debut, Fire in the Church, was a testament to his grind, charting at number 95 on the Billboard 200 with no major label backing. That's the number that hip-hop fans still bring up when they talk about Montana of 300's legacy. A Billboard 200 entry with zero major label muscle behind it. In an industry where chart positions are usually bought with marketing budgets most independent artists can't touch, Bradford cracked the Billboard 200 on the strength of grassroots fan loyalty alone. That album's quality wasn't lost on critics either. XXL magazine praised the project for its heat-seeking bars and thought-provoking metaphors, cementing Bradford's reputation as one of the more technically gifted lyricists to come out of Chicago's drill-adjacent scene. He wasn't just loud, he was layered, dense, the kind of rapper other rappers studied for wordplay. From there, the releases kept coming, and they came with a consistency that turned into its own kind of legend. Montana had become an emblem of self-sufficiency, releasing new music on May 20 of every year, a date that's taken on almost mythic importance among his fan base. Year after year, fans knew exactly when to expect new material. That kind of reliability is rare in an industry built on delays and scrapped rollouts, and it became one of the core reasons his fan base stayed as loyal as it did. He showed up when he said he would, every single time, for years. His next 4 albums, Don't Doubt the God, Pray for the Devil, A Gun in the Teacher's Desk, and Views from the General's Helmet, were each released on May 20, though the significance of the date is unknown. Whatever the reason behind that date, it became part of the ritual fans built around his career. May 20th wasn't just a release date, it was an event, a yearly checkpoint that fans built anticipation around the same way other fan bases build around tour announcements. That run eventually led to what he'd called his final chapter as a solo artist. His 6th album, Rap God, dropped in 2022 and was framed as his closing statement in that lane, the culmination of everything he'd built since the fire in the church days. For an artist who'd spent years positioning himself as an underdog who outworked everyone, ending on his own terms, on his own timeline, would have been the storybook finish to match the mythology the 300 name was built on. Instead, less than 3 years after that supposed farewell, Bradford found himself back in headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with music. The independence that defined his catalog, the chart success without a label, the yearly releases nobody could touch, the reputation as one of the hardest working voices in Chicago rap, none of that erases the guilty verdict now sitting on his record. If anything, it makes the fall feel steeper, because there was so much further to fall from, and that steep fall is exactly where this story sits right now. An artist with a Billboard charting independent catalog, a mythology built on never surrendering, now waiting to find out just how many years a judge is willing to take away from him. Right now, Montana of 300 is in the space between verdict and sentence, the part of the legal process where nothing is decided yet, but everything feels decided already. A jury has spoken. The number 12 is out there in headlines and fan pages across every platform. What hasn't happened yet is the actual hearing where a judge weighs everything, the charges, the history, the arguments from both sides, and decides exactly how much of that ceiling Bradford is actually going to serve. That gap between guilty verdict and formal sentencing is where a lot of these cases get shaped. It's where defense attorneys build arguments around character, around history, around whatever mitigating factors they can put in front of a judge to keep the number as far from that 12-year mark as possible. It's also where prosecutors lean into exactly the kind of pattern laid out earlier. The prior probation sentence, the years of legal exposure Bradford himself has spoken about publicly, the 4 stacked charges from the Peoria arrest itself. For his fans, this waiting period is its own kind of torture. The same divide that split people the day of the arrest is still splitting them now, except the stakes have gotten sharper. Fans can't help but wonder whether this recent setback will slow down his momentum, or if it's just another page in his relentless pursuit of greatness. And if the past has shown anything, Montana of 300 doesn't fold under pressure. He thrives in it. That's the hope plenty of longtime supporters are holding on to. That whatever number comes down at sentencing, this becomes another chapter in a comeback story rather than the final page. But hope isn't the same as certainty, and the math here is unforgiving. 12 years is the ceiling, not a guarantee, but it's a ceiling that exists because of exactly how serious the combination of charges turned out to be once a jury weighed all of it together. Even a sentence that lands well below that maximum could still mean years away from the stage, years away from a fan base that's built its entire relationship with him around consistency. The yearly album drops, the interviews, the presence that never seemed to disappear, even during his roughest stretches. What happens to a catalog like his during that kind of gap is its own open question. Streaming numbers don't stop when an artist goes away, but momentum does. New generations of hip-hop fans move fast, and years of silence, even involuntary silence, can turn an active career into a nostalgia act by the time someone's able to pick things back up. That's the quiet risk, sitting underneath every headline about this case, separate from whatever sentence eventually gets handed down. There's also the matter of what this means outside the music entirely. For Bradford as a father, as someone who spent years building a life around his kids in the middle of all this legal turbulence, the domestic case itself involved the mother of one of his children, which means whatever the sentencing outcome is, it's not just going to affect his career. It's going to affect a family that's already been living inside the fallout of that night in Peoria for over a year. For now, all anyone can do is wait for the date that puts a real number on all of this. The day a judge decides exactly how close to 12 years Montana of 300 actually has to serve. Whatever that number ends up being, it's going to close out one of the more complicated stories in independent hip-hop history. A career that proved you could chart nationally without a label. Built on a mythology of never surrendering, now facing the one opponent that mythology never accounted for. Whatever comes next, it won't just be a sentence. For a lot of the people who grew up on his catalog, it's going to feel like the end of an era they didn't see closing this fast.